Have you ever had a week where things were tense, but not completely terrible? Like it wasn't a full emotional disaster. It wasn't one of those weeks where you're crying over rice on the floor and questioning every decision that led you to this kitchen. But it also wasn't smooth. This week had some emotionally heavy moments, some tense moments, some moments where I had to sit there and ask myself, do I speak up or do I let this become someone else's problem? And then, weirdly enough, this week also had one of the best moments I've had in a while because we did Revenge of the Fifth. We had a Star Wars movie marathon. And my youngest son, who is 14 and has been a huge Darth Vader fan for years, somehow didn't know that Anakin Skywalker becomes Darth Vader. I know. I had to sit there and keep my entire face under control while cinematic history was unfolding in front of him. Because the whole time he thought Anakin was going to fight Darth Vader. And I'm sitting there like, oh baby, cinema is about to commit a crime against you. So this week was a mix. Some tension, some clarity, some work stuff that rolled right back around, and one really sweet reminder that sometimes the best moments are the ones where you get to watch someone experience something for the first time. So today, while I play House Flipper, I want to talk about clarity. The kind of clarity you have to ask for before things fall apart. And the kind of clarity you hold back because watching someone discover the truth is part of the magic. Hey y'all, welcome back to the channel. I'm Mrs. Charlie Black, and today we're playing House Flipper while I talk through this week. If you've been here before, you already know this is where I process real life over gameplay that lets my brain breathe just a little bit. House Flipper is perfect for this kind of commentary because it gives me something simple and clear to do. The house is messy, the tools are there, the task list makes sense. You clean, repair, paint, decorate, and move one step at a time. Real life, unfortunately, does not always come with a task list. Rude, honestly. So today's video is about what happens when you're the person in the room who sees the missing question and you have to decide whether or not you're going to ask it. And it's also about Star Wars because balance is important. If you've ever had to be the person who asks the obvious question nobody else is asking, go ahead and like the video because apparently some of us were born with built-in project management alarms and no way to turn them off. This week was varied. There were some emotionally heavy moments. There were some tense moments, but it wasn't like it was a few weeks ago. A few weeks ago felt like everything was stacking on top of me until one tiny thing finally made me break. This week didn't feel exactly like that. This week felt more like I was noticing patterns. And one of the biggest patterns was work. Because the situation from 2 weeks ago rolled right back around again. The same project issue came back up, and we ended up finding out that it was going to take much longer than we were initially told. Originally, it sounded like something that needed to be handled pretty quickly. The deadline was only a few weeks away. But once we actually had a full meeting and everyone started getting a foundational understanding of what needed to happen, it became clear that this was bigger than what people had originally understood. And here's the part that bothered me. After all of that discussion, after everyone had the chance to ask questions, after it was clear that the project was more involved than expected, no one asked if it was possible to get an extension. No one. And I'm sitting there thinking, am I missing something? Because that is literally the first thing that came to my mind. If the project is bigger than expected and the deadline is still only a few weeks away, the first thing I want to know is, can we get more time? Not because I'm trying to avoid work, not because I'm trying to make excuses, but because I want to know what the actual timeline is. If people are expected to complete something by a specific date, especially something that turns out to be bigger than expected, then clarity matters. How much time do we really have? Is the deadline firm? Is there room to extend it? Are we rushing for a reason, or are we rushing because nobody asked? That's the difference between a stressful project and a manageable one. And I sat there watching everyone say they didn't have any more questions. And I had a choice. I could stay quiet or I could speak up. And after what happened the last time with this situation, I really didn't think about staying quiet because things were tense and awkward after the last conversation surrounding this issue. And when something already feels awkward, speaking up can feel risky, especially when you're not technically the person leading the project. I'm not heavily involved in this project. There's one small part I'm involved in, and outside of that, there isn't anything else I really need to do. So part of me was like, this is not your responsibility. You don't need to step into this. But another part of me was looking at the situation like, this is going to come back around. And that's the part that gets me. Sometimes I don't speak up because I want control. Sometimes I speak up because I can already see the future problem walking toward us with a clipboard. And I don't want to be on the chopping block later for something I was not even really involved in. That's the uncomfortable part. I know there are things outside of my control. I know I shouldn't always put myself in situations where I'm trying to prevent every possible issue. But when I see a simple question that isn't being asked, it bothers me, especially when the question is not complicated. It's not some deep, complex, mysterious thing. It's simple. Can we ask for more time? That's it. And the fact that no one thought to ask it kind of frustrated me. Not because I think I'm smarter than anybody. That's not what I mean. It's more like, how are we all looking at the same situation and nobody is asking the thing that could make this easier for the people actually doing the work? So I spoke up. I asked if it was possible to get an extension, and an extension was granted, potentially as far out as the end of the year, which is a huge difference. That takes the project from we have almost no time to we have enough time to do this correctly. And when that happened, I felt relieved. Not proud necessarily, not like I needed a high five. I wasn't sitting there waiting for someone to say, wow, what a brilliant question. I don't need a tiny corporate parade because I asked about a deadline. But I felt relieved, mostly from my coworkers who actually have to do the project, because I could see it on their faces. No one really said, that was a great question. No one really acknowledged it out loud, but you could read the relief on their faces of the people who were going to have to do the work. And that mattered to me because now they had time, not panic time, not throw everything together and hope it survives time, not let's all sprint toward a deadline nobody questioned time, real time. Time to actually understand the work, time to plan, to ask follow-up questions, to do it correctly. And that's where I get frustrated sometimes because the person who was supposed to be heading this didn't seem to think of asking that question. And they also didn't really acknowledge that it was a useful question to ask. Again, I'm not looking for praise, but I do get frustrated when I feel like I'm stepping into shoes that I'm not supposed to be wearing. I'm not trying to lead the project. I'm not trying to take it over. I'm not trying to be the person in charge, or I'm not stepping into clarity. And I think that it's an important distinction that we do have clarity. And I shouldn't be stepping into somebody else's shoes. Because sometimes asking the question is not the same as picking up the responsibility. Sometimes asking the question is just saying, before everyone starts running in different directions, can we make sure we actually know where the road is? That's what clarity does. And clarity matters to me, especially when multiple people are involved, because people do things the way they see fit. Everybody has their own process, their own assumptions, and their own version of what they think the task means. And if expectations aren't clear, people start moving in different directions and calling it progress. Then later, everybody has to come back together and figure out why the pieces don't match. That is the kind of thing that makes my brain itch, because so many problems can be prevented by asking the simple question earlier. And maybe that is a control thing. I've thought about that. I've asked myself, am I trying to control this because I'm anxious? Am I trying to prevent things from going wrong because I don't want to deal with the fallout? And maybe the answer is partly yes, but I also think it's more complicated than that. Sometimes it's sometimes it's self-protection. Because when you have been in situations where things go wrong and somehow the blame or the stress spreads to people who weren't even in charge, you start learning to scan for problems early. You start noticing weak spots. You start seeing the dropped ball before it hits the floor. And then you're stuck with this question: do I sit here and watch things crash and burn? Or do I speak up? And I don't think there's always a perfect answer, because speaking up can be helpful, but speaking up can also put you closer to the problem. And sometimes people start relying on you to be the person who notices everything. That's a dangerous role. The person who notices. Because noticing is useful, but it's also exhausting. You notice the unclear deadline, the missing notes, the lack of ownership, the question nobody asked, that awkward tension, and you notice the future problem. And then you have to decide what to do with that information. That was the work part of my week. And it wasn't all bad. I'm glad I asked. I'm glad the extension was granted and my coworkers have more time. But it still left me thinking about how often I find myself asking questions that feel obvious to me and then wondering why they weren't asked before I said anything. And maybe some people just don't think that way. Maybe some people are focused only on the task in front of them. Maybe some people don't automatically scan the corners of a situation. Maybe some people don't immediately think, what's the timeline? What's the scope? Who owns this? What happens if we don't finish? Can we ask for more time? But I do. My brain goes there. And honestly, sometimes I feel that I appreciate that part of myself. Other times, I wish I could turn it off and just be a decorative plant in the meeting, a peaceful little office fern. No questions, no thoughts, just photosynthesis and vibes. But unfortunately, I have questions. So that was one side of the week, the tense side, the work side. The clarity needs to happen right now or people are going to suffer later side. But then there was the other side of the week, the good side, the part that really became the highlight for me. We celebrated May the 4th by doing Revenge of the 5th, and we decided to have a Star Wars movie marathon. The plan was to watch the entire series in one day. In my mind, this was possible because the movies we're watching, they added up to around 13 hours. And listen, 13 hours sounds like a lot. But in marathon logic, that's doable. Is it healthy? That's irrelevant. Is it ambitious? Yeah. Was I committed? Absolutely. But of course, life happened. Some things came up and our plans got shifted around, so we only made it to about halfway through episode 3. But honestly, it was still such a great time. I hadn't seen these movies in so long, so there were parts I had forgotten, parts I missed, parts that hit differently watching them now. And the best part was watching them with my youngest son. He's 14 and he's been a huge Darth Vader fan for years. Years. He loves Darth Vader. But somehow, he didn't know that Anakin becomes Darth Vader. And I cannot explain to you how wild it felt to realize that. Because as adults, some story reveals are so baked into pop culture that we forget there are people who genuinely don't know them yet. We forget that somebody out there still gets to experience the reveal for the first time. And I got to watch that happen with my son. The entire time, he kept thinking Anakin was going to defeat Darth Vader. He thought Anakin and Darth Vader were two separate people. And I just had to sit there quietly with this information. Do you know how hard that is? To sit next to someone who has been a Darth Vader fan for years while they're watching Anakin spiral closer and closer to becoming Darth Vader and they still don't know? That is emotional cardio. We got to the part where Anakin is called Lord Vader, and my son asked me when he was going to fight Darth Vader. Can I just I cannot wait to see his face when he realizes who Darth Vader really is. Because the buildup is everything. That is one of those moments I live for. And it's funny because after thinking so much about clarity at work, this was the opposite. At work, clarity needs to happen immediately. People need information, they need a timeline, they need expectations, they need to know what was actually possible. But with my son and Star Wars, the lack of clarity was part of the magic. I didn't want to explain it. I didn't want to spoil it. And I didn't want to say, oh, by the way, this is where everything is going. Because sometimes the gift is letting someone discover it. Sometimes the best thing you can do is sit quietly and let the story do what it was built to do. And I think that was the highlight of my week because it reminded me of something important. Not everything has to be managed. Not everything has to be clarified immediately. Not every moment needs me to step in and explain, fix, guide, or prevent. Sometimes the moment is better when I leave it alone. At work, speaking up created relief. At home, staying quiet preserved the joy. And I think that contrast is really interesting because the lesson this week isn't just speak up or stay quiet, it's knowing the difference. When people are about to walk into a stressful project with an unrealistic deadline, speak up, ask the question, create the clarity. But when your kid is watching one of the biggest reveals in movie history unfold in real time, stay quiet. Let the moment happen. Let them experience it. Let them be shocked. Let them have the memory. That's the balance I'm trying to learn. Because I think sometimes when you're used to being the person who notices things, you can start feeling like you always have to do something with what you notice. You notice the problem, so you ask the question. You notice the tension, so you try to smooth it out. You notice the missing piece, so you provide it. You notice the confusion, so you explain it. You notice the potential outcome, so you try to prevent it. And sometimes it's helpful. Sometimes it genuinely saves people stress. But other times, the best thing to do is let the story unfold. Let people have their experience. Let the moment breathe. And that's hard for me sometimes because clarity is important to me. I like knowing what's going on, understanding the expectations, knowing the timeline, knowing who owns what, and knowing whether something is urgent, flexible, or secretly on fire. But not every situation needs the same kind of clarity. Work needs clear communication because people are depending on that. A movie reveal needs mystery because that is literally the point. And maybe life sits somewhere in the middle. Maybe the skill is learning when to ask the question and when to let things unfold. This week reminded me that speaking up can be helpful, but it also reminded me that joy sometimes comes from not knowing yet. And watching my son experience Star Wars the way that he did was honestly beautiful because he wasn't analyzing the structure. He wasn't thinking about the writing. He wasn't thinking about decades of pop culture references. He was just in it, watching the story. He was rooting for Anakin. He was waiting for Darth Vader. And he had no idea what was coming. That kind of innocence is rare. Not innocence like being childish, but innocence like getting to meet a story without already knowing its secrets. There are so many things we only get to experience for the first time once. And getting to watch someone else have the first time experience is so special, especially when it's your kid, especially when it's something you already know, because you're not just watching the movie, you're watching them build a memory. And that was the best part of my week. Not because the whole week was perfect, it wasn't. There were tense moments, emotionally heavy moments, work frustration. There were moments where I found myself asking, why am I the only one who has to say this? But there was also that. There was my son asking when Anakin was going to fight Darth Vader. There was me sitting there trying not to spoil one of the biggest reveals ever. There was the joy of sharing something similar and something familiar and having it feel new because someone else is experiencing it for the first time. And I think I needed that. After the heaviness of the last few weeks, I needed a reminder that not every emotional moment is bad. Sometimes emotions are heavy because things are stressful, but sometimes emotions are heavy because something matters. And watching that with him mattered. If you've ever watched someone experience a movie, game, or story reveal for the first time and had to sit there silently like you were guarding a national secret, please tell me in the comments because that is a very specific kind of struggle. And if you're enjoying this kind of reflective gaming commentary, go ahead and like the video and subscribe. I'm trying to make this a space where we can talk about life, work, stress, joy, and all the weird little moments in between while playing games that let the brain settle down for a minute. I think the thing I'm taking from this week is that clarity is not just about information. It's about care. At work, asking for clarity was a way of caring about the people who had to do the project. Because if the deadline was unrealistic and nobody questioned it, they would have been the ones carrying the stress. They would have been the ones trying to make something big happen in almost no time. And maybe they would have figured it out eventually. Maybe someone else would have asked later. Maybe the deadline would have shifted anyway. But in that moment, the question needed to be asked. And I'm glad I asked it. Even if nobody said thank you, even if nobody said it was a great question, even if the person leading it didn't seem to fully recognize the importance of asking it, I'm still glad I asked because the relief was visible. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes you don't need acknowledgement to know something mattered. You can see it. But I also don't want to ignore the frustration because it is frustrating to feel like you are repeatedly seeing things that other people are missing, especially when the things feel simple. Not easy necessarily, but simple. Ask for the deadline. Ask who owns the task. Ask whether there's documentation. Ask if there's a recording. Ask if the timeline can move. Ask what done looks like. These are not wild questions. These are basic structural questions. And when they don't get asked, everything gets messier. That's probably why House Flipper is so satisfying. Because in the game, the mess is usually obvious. There's dirt on the floor, trash in the room, broken outlets, walls that need paint, furniture that needs assembling, and the game tells you what needs to happen. Real life doesn't always do that. Real life has people sitting in meetings saying they have no more questions while I'm mentally pointing at the giant flashing question mark in the corner. And I know I'm not the only one like this. Some of you are probably the same way. You're the person who notices the missing piece. You're the person who asks, wait, who is responsible for that? You're the person who says, do we actually have enough time? You're the person who catches the part of the plan that sounds fine until somebody has to actually do it. And that can be valuable, but it can also be tiring. Because once people know you notice, sometimes they start expecting you to keep noticing. And that's where boundaries matter. That's where I have to remind myself. Asking a clarifying question does not mean I own the project. Pointing out a gap does not mean I am responsible for filling it. Noticing a problem does not mean I have to become the solution. That's a lesson I'm still learning because I can speak up without picking everything up. And I think this week was a good example of that. I asked a question, the extension was granted, people got more time, and then I stayed in my lane. That mattered because last time the situation left me feeling embarrassed, anxious, and like I had somehow stepped into something messy. This time, I spoke up more cleanly. I asked the question that needed to be asked, and I didn't take over. That feels like progress. Not dramatic progress, not movie montage progress, but real progress. The kind where you handle something a little differently than you would have before. And maybe that is what this week's commentary is really about. Learning when to speak up without absorbing the whole problem. Learning when clarity is needed. Learning when silence is actually part of the joy. And learning that a week can have both tension and beauty in it. Because this week had both. It had work stress. It had that familiar frustration of wondering why the obvious question wasn't being asked. But it also had a Star Wars marathon. It had my son unknowingly walking straight into one of the biggest character reveals of all time. It had laughter and anticipation, and me trying to keep my mouth shut like my life depended on it. And that was good. That was really good. Sometimes the highlight of the week is not a huge event. Sometimes it's sitting on the couch watching a movie you've already seen, but it feels new because someone you love is seeing it differently. Sometimes it's hearing your kid ask a question and realizing they have no idea what is coming. Sometimes it's getting to witness wonder before the world explains everything. And I think I needed that reminder because work can make everything feel urgent. Everything needs an answer. Everything needs clarity. Everything needs a plan. Everything needs a deadline. Everything needs someone to ask the question. But life outside of work needs room too. Room for surprises, room for slow reveals, room for moments that don't need to be optimized, room for joy that isn't productive, room to watch Anakin become Darth Vader while your son thinks Darth Vader is still waiting somewhere else for a boss fight. And listen, I cannot wait to see his face when the full realization hits, because we stopped around the part where Anakin is called Lord Vader. So he knows something is happening, but I don't think he fully understands yet. He still thinks Anakin is going to fight Darth Vader, and I am waiting patiently, like a Sith parent, just quietly watching the emotional damage approach, but in a loving way. So the lesson this week is probably this. Not every situation needs the same version of you. Sometimes you need to be the person who speaks up. Sometimes you need to be the person who asks the question. Sometimes you need to say, can we get more time? Or can we clarify who owns this? Or can we make sure everyone is working from the same information? Because clarity can prevent chaos. Clarity can give people relief. Clarity can make the work fairer. But sometimes you need to be the person who stays quiet and lets the moment unfold. Sometimes the gift is not explaining. Sometimes the joy is in watching someone discover the truth in their own time. And I think this week gave me both. At work, clarity helped. At home, mystery made the moment better. And somewhere between those two things, I'm trying to learn balance because I don't want to stop being someone who notices. That part of me is useful. It helps me catch things. It helps me understand systems. It helps me ask good questions. But I also don't want to become responsible for everything I notice. That's difference. I can ask the question without becoming the project lead. I can notice the gap without jumping into the hole. I can care without carrying the whole thing. And maybe that's the real work for me. Not learning how to stop noticing, but learning what to do with what I notice. So, yeah, that was this week. A little tense, a little emotionally heavy, but also genuinely sweet. I had to speak up at work and ask a question that gave people more time and hopefully more peace. And then I got to sit with my son and watch him experience Star Wars in a way I honestly didn't think was still possible. No spoilers, no prior knowledge, just him fully believing Anakin was going to defeat Darth Vader. And me sitting there like, this is parenting, this is cinema, this is history. So I'm taking that with me. The work stuff mattered, the clarity mattered, but that Star Wars moment, that was the highlight. That was the part I want to remember. Because sometimes a week does not have to be perfect to have something beautiful in it. Sometimes it just needs one clear question and one good memory. If you enjoyed hanging out with me today, go ahead and like the video, leave a comment, subscribe, and share it with someone who also asks the obvious questions in meetings and then goes home to emotionally recover with a movie marathon. If you've ever watched someone discover a major plot twist for the first time, please tell me about it. I need to know what reveal you were silently suffering through. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And I'll see y'all in the next one.